Thank you very much. I should say I am not a Feng Shui expert, but I'm here to share my experience of greening cities, and I'm sure there'll be lots of areas of mutual interest. But having said I'm not a Feng Shui expert, I did spend some time working in Hong Kong and China, especially in the 1990s, and I was quite interested to learn at that time that when I asked where the most biodiverse woodlands were in Hong Kong, I was told that the Feng Shui woodlands in the villages. And it was explained to me that these villages were settled 400 or 500 years ago according to Feng Shui principles, so that the mountain would be behind the village. There'd be a Feng Shui woodland behind that village which would provide medicines and building materials, and people used to really nurture that environment. There would be streams below the village would be set above flood zones, and a whole range of other very, very sound principles which actually should be the basis of good environmental planning. And in many ways, those 500-year-old principles, or I'm sure they go back much further than that, but the practice that was demonstrated in those villages was something that should be used to this very day in China. So that was my first experience of that, and I was astonished to find that these Feng Shui woodlands really were nature reserves in effect. So there's a great legacy to begin with, and of course this is part of this approach to life which is sometimes overlooked, this idea of greening the neighbourhood, greening the region, greening the city. Now I'm interested in greening cities, but I think you'll agree there's a lot that we can learn from this kind of approach. Now in 1992, most nations in the world signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the idea is that the war with nature was officially over, and we were starting to work with nature to restore biodiversity. Of course, that message hasn't quite got through to everyone yet. I have to remind my colleagues quite often that the war with nature is over. And this is about working with nature. Now, the people behind this, back in the 90s, started to talk about the ecosystem approach. Working with nature, and saying that nature provides us with goods and services, and we need to cherish nature in order to continue to receive those goods and services. We cannot survive without nature. I know it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it's not necessarily something that everyone fully appreciates. People sometimes think nature's an optional extra, a nice to have. Politicians decide it's not a priority, and so on and so forth. But of course we know, most of us know, that we cannot survive without nature. Now these ecosystem services that people are starting to talk about more and more, it's taken about 25 years for this to come through to planners and policymakers. But these goods and services it's this idea that as well as providing us with raw materials like timber, which is an obvious thing, nature also provides us with clean air, it helps to mitigate flood, the soil nurtures us, and so on and so forth, and people are studying these things in more and more detail, and there's still a lot to learn about that. Now, of course, this implies that you protect nature, and you can receive those benefits, okay? But also, very important is that you can restore nature. You can bring nature back to places where it's been damaged or completely removed. And by restoring nature, you're then bringing these services to places where they may be absent. And this is at the heart of greening cities. Now cities are hotter and drier and more polluted than, if you like, the hinterland, the wider environment. And that's because nature's been stripped away. And we now know that by restoring nature, by greening cities, we can fix an awful lot of problems. So this is the language that I often have to talk to decision makers and politicians, they know that there are financial costs to cities being hotter or drier or more flooded or whatever it is than other areas, and by explaining that by greening, that's a very cost-effective way of reducing those costs. And those people that always insist on cost-benefit analysis and so on, they're more likely to be persuaded. Now, the other big idea about working with nature is that nature tends to do a lot of things at once. So a forest is different from a city in the sense that a forest is not divided up into one area which specializes in photosynthesis and another area for one type of animal and another area for another type of animal and an area for drainage and an area for flood, like in the way that cities are divided up. So increasingly we're telling architects and planners to think about multifunctionality, try and do a lot of different things at once. Don't just say, this is an industrial area, greening isn't appropriate. Why not? Or this is a residential area, therefore we don't need to worry about anything other than the immediate needs of the people that are living there. So this is a holistic approach, it's a multifunctional approach. Now I'm just going to talk now briefly about this idea of the water-sensitive city. Now water has conventionally been considered a bit of a problem for cities. Since the Industrial Revolution especially, people have considered rain to be a nuisance. Rain's been put immediately into drains and sent into rivers. The rivers become polluted by an over-reliance on drains. We're causing downstream problems because we're pushing the water very, very rapidly downstream. And by having all these sealed surfaces, we're drying out the city, we're causing it to overheat, and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that. So what we're saying is we need to work with nature, we green it, we embrace water, we work with water. We do more with it, and that way we get those benefits. So what do? We restore nature. But of course, if we restore nature completely, we don't have a city. I understand that. I'm not that naive. But we can bring a lot of natural features into a city, and this doesn't just mean in new development. We can add to the older areas, and in that way we can slow down water, we can capture water, we can clean up rivers by doing that, we can cool the city, we can calm people down, we can reduce mental illness and so on. And there's evidence for this now, a lot of evidence for this. Where we put rivers underground, we can bring them back to the surface. So there's a lot we can do. Now it may be that they're not all giant projects, many of them may be very small, but cumulatively all these small projects added together can start to really make a difference. So that's a different way of looking at water. Of course we need to manage it, but we need to be more positive about the way that we look at water. Now one of the fears, one of the problems of cities, and this is an American city, Atlanta, Georgia, and we can take a thermal image of that on a hot summer's day. One of the problems with cities is that they suffer from what's known as the urban heat island. So what that means is the sun beats down on all those sealed surfaces, those dense materials, and that heat is re-radiated at night, so cities become hot. And with climate change, this is predicted to become worse. It's already a problem. And if we take a thermal image of a city, you can see these are temperatures, and the areas which are cool in that picture are parks. So that gives you a clue. The areas that are red and 50 degrees centigrade are car parks and sealed surfaces. Now we can zoom in and look at this in a bit more detail. It works at all scales. So this is Tokyo, which can get very hot in the summer. And this just happens to be a picture of an area where you've got all different conditions so that you can look at the temperatures. So just make a note before I switch to the thermal image. that you've got a road, a railway, some buildings, but you also happen to have a roof garden on a podium there. And we can see that at the hottest part of the day, the road is 50 degrees centigrade, the railway station is even hotter, the roof of the railway station, but the roof garden is at ambient temperature. And the reason for that is because the sun's rays are shielded by vegetation, and the water that's evaporating from the soil is cooling it down. It's called evaporative cooling. So this is the solution to the urban heat island effect. More soil and vegetation and water into the city, which just happens to be a nice thing anyway. And that saves a lot of money, it reduces air conditioning, and it saves lives. So in the heat wave in Paris a few years ago, a lot of people died because they weren't able to leave their apartments, which were in the top floor, below a grey roof that was very, very hot, and people died. So this saves lives. Now, one of the ways that we can address some of these problems and work with water is to establish what I like to call rain gardens. Now, the technical people call these bioinfiltration swales and so on. They call them sustainable urban drainage systems, but of course when I talk to the public about sustainable urban drainage systems, they normally take no interest. But if I call them rain gardens, as the Americans are now, people warm to that. They often say to me, you know, I really love the rain garden. I don't really know what it is, but I love it because it just sounds so nice. So I tend to use the term because people seem to warm to it. And it's a very simple idea. Instead of sending water straight into a drain, we send it into a specially designed garden that absorbs that rain and it helps to irrigate the plants and so on. It means slightly different soils and planting. It's not necessarily a wet area. It doesn't have to be wet all the time. It can look like an ordinary garden. It's just working in a slightly different way. So, as I've said, it deals with a lot of these problems. It also means we can do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. We can grow food in cities, and we can improve our health and so on. Now, sometimes this can be a very, 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 very simple intervention. So this is a housing estate in North London, where instead of having a lawn which is mown every 2 weeks, water that overflows from a water butt goes into this garden, and then if it ever floods, it then overflows into a drain. So it's very, very simple. It can be more technical, so that it's designed to take, for instance, runoff from a road. So instead of going into the drain and polluting the streams and so on, it can be diverted into a swale. So this is in Portland, Oregon. So you can see this is a little bit different from the conventional situation in a street where the water goes into disappears underground, no one quite knows what happens to it. But actually the problem is that will end up in a river and pollute the river. And the fear in Portland, Oregon is that their salmon, which need very high quality water, would be badly affected. So what they've done is a city-wide approach to making sure that polluted water from streets goes into these rain gardens. And it just so happens that means people have to think a little bit more about those areas. And as I say, they're wet during a storm, and in Portland, Oregon, it rains a lot more than it does here. They have about 3 times as much rain as we do. And it might be wet for a couple of hours and then it just returns to a normal looking garden. And there are lots of other interesting ways of working with water. So for instance, people often hear about traffic calming. We want to slow down speeding cars in streets. That's often done with concrete. You can do this with rain gardens. And this is very interesting because it's taking a new source of money. So often we're told there's no money for gardens, there's cuts and so on, it's not a priority. But we're finding that there might be money to spend on concrete. There's always money to spend on concrete. I don't know how that works, but that's how it works. So I can take money that would be spent on concrete and I can spend it on a rain garden which is multifunctional. So if someone wants this to be for traffic calming, it can be designed for that. If they want it to be for biodiversity, it can be for that. If they wanted to reduce flood, it can be for that, and so on and so on. So it's multifunctional. And you can even do this right in city centres. So areas that would otherwise not really be doing anything can become part of our flood management system. And a lot of this is about not completely changing everything that we have, so that, for instance, where we have a conventional downpipe going into a drain, we can very easily make a small planting, and then if that overflows, it can go back into the conventional drain. So it's not something for old-fashioned people to be frightened of. So a lot of my colleagues who are drainage engineers get very, very worried, but of course all this does is take the pressure off of the conventional system. It doesn't replace it, although I would like to replace it, but I think that's something that's many decades away. Now another very nice intervention which I'd like to talk about now is green roofs. So these might be roof gardens, or they might be what we call extensive green roofs, and they're also about the water-sensitive city because they intercept a lot of the rain that would normally hit a roof and then go straight into the drain. So about half of the rain that falls on a roof garden or a green roof is stored in the soil and then lost through evaporation. And it's a very simple thing. You have your waterproofing, which you have anyway. And Germans have pioneered this technology. They've been doing this since the 1960s, so they've written the standards. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's usually some kind of drainage layer. There's a layer that keeps the sediments from the drains, and then there's a special soil, a lightweight soil that's been developed for green roofs. Just not, you shouldn't really be using an ordinary soil because they tend to be heavy and they clog the drains. And then the planting. So that's the technical part. We won't dwell on that because it's not a workshop on landscape construction. But you know, there are lots and lots of roof gardens now, and there are more and more and more all over the world. They're very popular. 2 weeks ago, the French government announced that green roofs will now be compulsory on new developments. They're already compulsory in Switzerland, some German cities, a lot of American cities. London has a policy. It's a very British thing. We have an expectation that there's green roofs, which means if you really don't want to do it, you can get away with it. But anyway, I often struggle to explain that to my colleagues overseas, but it's working. There are a lot of green roofs in London now. And this is Cannon Street railway station, so this is a park in effect on a roof. You can hold a wedding there. It's managed in a conventional way. This was a convention center in Japan, Fukuoka, where they wanted to extend the area of the park, so they extended it onto a public building. And interestingly, this has become a focus for an annual event where people have a candlelit procession which goes through the park and up the buildings, very, very pretty. So these are parks and gardens on buildings, expensive, very pleasant. But if it's something that's not for people to access, but perhaps to benefit the environment and cool the building, improve the insulation, then that can be something that's much more low-key. So that would be what we call an extensive green roof. It's very lightweight. It receives hardly any maintenance. This is in Canary Wharf, the financial district. This is a German example of the same kind of thing. And actually, this is an very old tradition of a very low maintenance green roof. The Scandinavians have done this for a long time. It's very practical, and funnily enough, it wasn't really about protecting the environment. The very first ones were about stopping the wind blowing the roof away, frankly. So, you know, this is very, very simple and practical. Now, as I say, in Switzerland, all commercial buildings above 1,000 square meters must have a green roof, and the emphasis there is on nature, so encouraging butterflies and bees and so on. So you can go to the city and they will explain how to do that. So this is Basel, and all the buildings have green roofs designed for rare spiders and beetles. And everyone's very relaxed about it. These aren't gardens, they're there, they're doing a job, they're cooling the buildings, they're helping to reduce flood. It's very, very simple, but when you're fortunate enough to visit it, it's very impressive and beautiful. And working with nature and following this philosophy leads to some very interesting things. So the architect Hundert Wasser, who's no longer with us, wants to restore nature in its totality and put natural woodlands on buildings. And this is all possible. Now, I'm just going to, before I move away from green roofs, I just want to tell you about, very briefly, on the history of this, that in Germany in the 1880s there were a lot of tenement blocks, high-rise, the first concrete multi-storey buildings which had flat roofs with bitumen. They were a fire hazard. So they covered them with sand. And over the years these were colonised with sedums and lichens, and this is a green roof that's more than 100 years old in Berlin. And this was the inspiration for the modern green, lightweight green roof. People saw this after the Second World War, a few of them survived, and they thought, well, this was done almost by accident, but we could start to do this deliberately. So this is a very interesting story. Of course, the way that people have interpreted this now, they've simplified it, they've lost some of the diversity, they've commercialised it, and at the moment a lot of my work is trying to bring the diversity back into what has become rather a monotonous commercial product. But as I say, it's not just about nature, it's about people. So this is the head office of Lend-Lease, and this is about Lunchtime Gardening Club. And they wanted a screen, and I wanted to do what I could for nature. So this is a bee hotel. This is a hotel for solitary bees that nest in small holes. And what's exciting about this is that the bees like it, and the office workers are monitoring this. They're photographing these bees. They've adopted different people have adopted each hole. They're watching at lunchtime, and they're emailing these to the experts. So this is something people are really engaged with. Now, we've been auditing the potential for green infrastructure in various parts of London. So this is Victoria, and the planners are saying, well, what could we do, what do we have at ground level in the way of greenery, and what could we do? So we mark the trees, and you can see there's not that many trees in Victoria. There's a few parks there, the green areas. And they're saying if we were very brave and very bold, and we spent a lot of money, we could make parks in the purple areas. So that's what we could do. And it's not very much, and frankly, the owners of those purple areas would rather have buildings, so the chances are those parks will never be built. But anyway, that's an exercise for planners. But then when we go to roof level, even those existing buildings have potential. Not all of them, because not every roof is strong enough to be fitted with a green roof. But at roof level, about a third of the commercial buildings can be made into green roofs. And of course, the new ones should all have green roofs. So this is where we can really make a difference. And this is an example of that. So this is the headquarters of Transport for London, which has a biodiverse, extensive green roof designed for wildlife. So we're now following the Swiss example in London. And I've been in debates about this. I was told by someone this was not possible in London, and they didn't know that we'd already done it. So I was able to win that argument by showing this slide. Now, as well as the roofs, there are also other interesting opportunities. So this is a hotel in Victoria where we said, well, okay, there's a blank facade, and inspired by the work in Paris by Patrick Blanc, who started to vegetate walls in 10 or 15 years ago now, we were starting to say, well, we could do that. We make the Photoshop, we go and see the owner. Most of the time the owner says, well, I don't really want to do this because I'm worried, or I don't have the money. But the owner of this hotel, to my shock, said, yes, I'd like to do that. Can you start immediately? So I couldn't actually speak for about half an hour because as I say, nearly every time this happens, people say no, and then you go and grumble. And so when they say yes, that's a big challenge. But this was installed. By the way, it's not maintained by outsailors. There is a cradle. This is a publicity stunt. But this really has made a difference. And the big breakthrough with this roof is that we're irrigating it with rainwater. So we capture all the rainwater from the roofs there, which are Victorian buildings, so we can't make gardens. We store them in tanks on the first floor, and then that water is pumped through the wall, and that means that there's less water going into the drains, and Victoria gets flooded in storms, and the stations close, and millions of pounds worth of damage is done by lost work. So the mayor put 10% into this because of that, we've even put these louvers between the walls because that was a way of reducing the noise and dust getting to hotel rooms. And what this has done is saved on their cooling bill in summer, their air conditioning. It's brought a more cheerful outlook to that part of Victoria, and people are starting to see the possibilities. Now, on a smaller scale, we've also put in some of these, what I'm calling vertical rain gardens. So these are not technically difficult, they're not pumped. What happens here is that you intercept a dam pipe, you put water into slim tanks behind the wall, and then it very slowly seeps out into the wall. Now, this was an experiment, I wasn't sure it was going to work. To my relief, after 2 years, it's still there and it's still working. The only problem with this was people stealing plants. But now the people that live here are keeping a close eye on that, so that's reduced somewhat. And that's just a drawing to show how that works in detail. You can see on the left these slimline tanks that fill with rainwater and seep through into the living wall. So what I've done today really is just to give you a flavour of some of the more innovative ways that we can green cities, and to remind you, I expect most of you already had a pretty good idea of the benefits that come from that. So, of course, there are many other more conventional things that we can do. We can plant more trees and have more gardens and so on. But I'd like to think those more conventional things are things that people are aware of. But what I wanted to show you was that even in the most hostile places, we can really do something different. And so, just to sum up and give you some food for thought, there's a few suggestions here. Now, we probably have more paving than we actually need. And it's quite common for designers to pave areas because they think, well, it'd be easy to look after, or look quite nice. But actually, it's much better to try and expose soil, grow plants, intercept the rain. So depaving is a good t-shirt to wear. I'm a depaver, put it that way. And it's just something to bear in mind, because often we pave without thinking. Of course, there are practical problems. People pave front gardens, they call it urban creep. They pave front gardens for car parking. But even then, if that was a necessity, you can have permeable paving. There are things that you can do. So depave. Then disconnect the downpipe. So this is your other t-shirt. I'm a downpipe disconnector. So, where's that downpipe going? All right, we think once it's gone in through that grill, we can forget about it, but actually there are consequences. It's a pollutant. It causes flood somewhere. So can we disconnect that? Can we store rainwater? Can we harvest rainwater? There's a lot you can do on that. You can use it for toilet flushing and so on. So there's a whole world of rainwater harvesting you can look at, if not a rain garden. So that's something, if you want a vertical rain garden, living walls, so if you have the money and the opportunity, there's a lot you can do. You can become a downpipe disconnector. You can send that into a rain garden. You can harvest rainwater. A lot of people are now greening their roofs. Sometimes it's not feasible along the buildings. Sometimes it needs a little bit of strengthening, but it's something that a lot of people are doing now. You can vegetate walls. We can vegetate these walls with these panels that they're panels or pockets. You can buy them now. And a lot of the schools that I go to, they buy one panel, which has 36 pockets, one for each child in the class. They fit it to the wall, and they water it by hand. So there's a lot that, it doesn't have to be high tech, and a giant installation can be very, very simple. Just last week we put a herb wall in to an outdoor cooking demonstration area, so the chef has the herbs handy in a wall. When they're not cooking, it just looks nice to have herbs on a wall. The other thing is that we want to work with nature, we want to work with wildlife. Of course, we have our own needs, but as we saw in the Feng Shui woodlands in the new territories in Hong Kong, by providing herbs and medicines and timber, we're actually benefiting wildlife as well if those plants are used to growing together and they're indigenous plants. So we don't have to only use that, but by working with nature we can do a lot more. We can find out about the needs of those different birds and butterflies, and what is the food plant of that butterfly. Not just what it drinks when it's an adult, the nectar, but the caterpillars. Where do they live? It's easy to find that out and plant accordingly. And this ties into, of course, making sure that we don't plant randomly, we don't put things that are not happy to be growing in a particular place. And there's lots of advice on that. And I think that people with your background, with an interest in these things, will understand that. You have to think carefully about where you plant things. And if you're interested, I have a book on the ecosystem approach to greening cities. So that's my introduction to urban greening.